Hello and welcome. You're watching Lockdown TV from unheard.com. In less than 7 weeks' time, voters in America will go to the polls. It is no exaggeration to say it is the biggest question in the world. Who's going to win? Will it be President Trump or will it be a new President Biden? So, in a way, it's not dissimilar from the coronavirus question in that we're getting a lot of data. There's polls coming out, charts, models, there's a lot of information to process. And we want to try and get underneath it, get into it, and understand what we think the real state of the race is. So for the next hour, we will be focusing on one question. Who do we think is actually going to win? So this is not about who we want to win. So if you have strong views in either direction, you need to try and put them to one side. Here we are now only interested in who is going to win. So who have we got? Number one, we have Nate Silver, the most famous name connected to opinion polling in the world. He runs a website called 538. He's the founder editor there. And his name is really synonymous with more sophisticated methods of producing models and forecasts for these elections. And we absolutely had to hear from him. We've also spoken to a man called Robert Cahaly. He is, as it were, the dissenting pollster. He's the guy who thinks differently from the rest of the pack, and he thinks that Trump is actually ahead. So we're going to hear from him how he gets there and how much we should trust his view. And we're also speaking to Professor Doug Rivers, who is chief scientist at YouGov, the polling company. They have, again, a slightly different method, but they're showing a substantial Biden advantage at this point. So we've spoken to all three of these experts. We've edited their thoughts together for you, kind of by theme. So we're asking big questions. What is the state of play? What is the information? And why can't they agree? What could happen in the next 7 weeks that could change everything? How could that currently seemingly unlikely Trump victory actually take place? And third, is there some kind of herd mentality? Our name is Unheard. We investigate herd mentality whenever we see it. In which case, which direction does it go? Are people underestimating Trump's chances? Or are they overestimating them? So let's kick off with Nate Silver. He produces something called a model at his website 538, and they input all the different poll results that come out every day and every week and end up with something like a percentage likelihood. So they're currently saying around about 24% chance of a Trump victory, 76% chance of a Joe Biden victory. At the time of filming, it was more like 30 Trump, 70 Biden. I asked him, how does he prevent the conventional wisdom from influencing his projections?
It's a weird election, though, because it's a little bit hard to hone in and diagnose what the conventional wisdom is exactly. If you go to betting markets at the time we're recording this, they have Biden as only about a 55% favorite. To me, that seems hard to justify low on Biden, right? I mean, he is up by 9 points. He does have disadvantage like the Electoral College, but that, I don't think that quite computes, right? At the same time, I don't think the average news cover, the average news coverage in the U.S. kind of recognizes that Biden is ahead. Frankly, when our model released, we're used to getting kind of big pushback in one direction or another from kind of traditional reporters. Everyone kind of nodded and said, okay, 70% seems about right to me, right? So for better or worse, kind of our forecast and the conventional wisdom are aligned. There are other models out there that have Trump as high or as low as 10%, and Biden at 90%. I do not think those are necessarily well-constructed models. But everyone is there's a meme that everybody is overconfident about Biden, but in fact, except maybe for one or two models, not the 538 model, people are quite cautious on Biden and are extremely willing to say, yes, Trump can win re-election.
I mean, do you not think it's fair to say that? I mean, I've seen election models being built as well, and they are not immune from that kind of input, realistically. I mean, there are so many inputs that you can either consciously or subconsciously tweak. You said that the 70-30 feels about right to you, which in a way set off a bit of a warning in my head, because I thought, really you'd want your model to surprise you and you to publish it anyway. If it feels right, maybe that somewhere along the line, your team has kind of made it come out about right. I mean, how do you protect yourself from herd mentality in that way?
So it did surprise me a bit. I thought we'd probably be at 80 or 85% on Biden. The way literally we protect ourselves is like we try to do as much as we can. I call it like blindfolded, right? So we will make whatever changes to the model we're making for 2020, which because of COVID and other things, we think there are some things that you have to think about, right? Go ahead and back test the model, right? And then the very last thing we do will be to run through the 2016 numbers, right? I mean, not the very last thing, because when you're running, or the 2020 numbers, I should say, right? Not the very, very last thing, because, you do want to sanity check when you see the actual results. But yeah, I was thinking like, oh, we'll probably have Biden at 80 or 85, right? And I'll be prepared to argue why that's not overconfident, right? And it turned out that he was only at 71% or whatever when we launched. Yeah. So it did surprise me a bit.
Is that not roughly what it was before 2016 in favor of Hillary? It's
pretty similar. So yeah, in fact, I think Clinton on the last day of 2016 was at 71% and Trump at 29%. In August, it was the exact same number, 71-29. Right. So, but it's a little apples to apples because you're comparing an election day forecast to like what it says in August. If Biden reaches November 3rd with an 8 or 9 point lead, then we run that scenario and he'll be like 90 or 95% to win. So not 100. I mean, 5 or 10% chance is actually not trivial. But then that would justify a lot of confidence and then saying, oh, something went horribly wrong with either the polls or the election itself if Trump won. The thing that still bothers me about 2016 when our model always gave Trump a decent chance, more than conventional wisdom did, was that like the polls showed a fairly close race. It also showed tons of undecided voters. The polls were quite volatile, right? And so kind of people blame 2016 on the polls, but like if you're looking at the polls correctly, the polls would have told you that like actually this is a competitive election.
So what Nate puts into his model is ultimately opinion poll results. They're surveys conducted and published every day, every week, and there'll be more and more of them as the election approaches. We've spoken to 2 pollsters who conduct those kind of surveys. And the first one we want you to hear from is called Robert Cahaly from Trafalgar. So where most surveys are showing a healthy Joe Biden advantage, maybe 6, 7, 8 points, he takes a different view, and he thinks Donald Trump is actually ahead.
What we show now is a very competitive race in Arizona, very, very close. I would say probably too close to call. Michigan, I see a Trump lead, a definite Trump lead. Wisconsin, I see a Trump lead. Minnesota, I see dead even. North Carolina, Ohio, Trump wins. Texas and Georgia are not battleground states. Trump will win, and it won't be within 3 points. And Pennsylvania, I think, is tight. So the scenario I've just gone over there is a Trump in the mid 270s, possibly getting to just below 280, and it is just 270 to win. So right now, I would say if the election were held today, he would probably eke out a victory.
So, Mr. Cahaly, you're finding very different results from the mainstream, as much as 10 points apart. How do you explain that difference?
We think that what's happening is what is technically called the social desirability bias. And what that means is people give an answer to a question being asked by a live caller that is less about honesty and more about being judged positively by the person asking the question. So when there is a candidate who is polarizing, who it isn't politically correct to say you're for, you tend to give an answer that you think will, kind of make you look best. And this was very evident in 2016. We saw it in 2018 in the Florida governor's race. And now we're seeing it this year. And probably more this year. As I say quite often, 4 years ago, the worst thing they said about the Trump supporters is they were deplorable. This year, it's quite worse. And we're seeing this. And where this effect is most amplified is with a live caller. And so we actually think polls done by live callers are the worst way to poll this race. And most of these polls that the media accepts as the standard are live call based. They actually suggest that those people who don't use live calls exclusively are not effective, not legitimate polls.
What's your method at Trafalgar?
Well, we have, if you look us up, we have quite a few different methods that we mix together so that we can get a more accurate balance, whether it be live, automated, text message, email, and a few different platforms we use over digital means. But think about it this way. There are things that a person says on that Facebook page where there are pictures of their family that their colleagues see, and there are things they say on that private one they set up just to vent. The problem is what they say on that private page when they think they're anonymous is what's in their heart. And what's in their heart is how they vote. And so people are kind of putting on their best behavior with a live person. So what we found is that social desirability bias, as it was 4 years ago, is between 3 and 5%, and we expect it could be more, of people who just aren't going to tell you where they really are. And they're going to give you an answer that judges them the least.
So how do you find that 3 to 5% number?
Well, in 2016, we did it by asking the question, all right, we understand who you're for. Now, who do you think the majority of your neighbors are for? And that's what I have learned over the years. That's a little device you use to get them to kind of admit who they're for without having to accept what they perceive to be the blowback of being for that. Well, we're not going to tell people how we're doing it this year because now everyone is using what we did in 2016, and I have yet to see any of them give us any credit. So, yes, we've developed other questions, additional questions that we ask that give us a sense of where you really are. So the people that are answering a third-party candidate who have no history of voting any sort of third party in a primary, the people who are answering that they are undecided, the people who are giving lukewarm answers on these when there's low intensity, we can look in there and see, okay, the other questions give us a sense of where they really are.
The next pollster we're going to hear from is called Doug Rivers. He's chief scientist at a company called YouGov. So they do things slightly differently. Instead of the telephone calls that Robert Cahaly was complaining about, they do all of their surveys online, which in theory at least should mitigate any so-called shy Trump effect. And yet they're still showing Joe Biden significantly ahead.
So we do something different than other people. I don't know exactly what Trafalgar does. But our method is we have a panel of people, hundreds of thousands of people who've signed up to take surveys who we interview repeatedly over time. And so what that enables us to see is the same people at different points in time and whether they've changed or not. And what we've seen is about 7% of the Trump voters, which is about roughly 3.5% of the total voting population, now says that they will vote for Biden rather than Trump. And there's only a 1% offsetting flow in the other direction. So that's a big deal. The second thing we've seen is that among third-party voters, so about 5% of the vote was third-party voters in 2016. Those are splitting slightly towards Biden. And then people who didn't vote that we think are going to vote this time, and in particular 18 to 21-year-olds that couldn't vote, they are splitting by literally 30 to 40 points in Biden's direction. So we think all the movement is from, Democrats winning by 2% in 2016 to high single digits in 2020.
Which is, so what's the current model? I mean, are you running one of these big MRP models for this election?
We are. We haven't unveiled it in full, but it's showing around 340 electoral votes for Biden.
And an 8 or 9 point advantage in the popular vote?
Yes. We released a national poll yesterday with CBS that had Biden up by 10. We released one earlier in the week that was +7, and another one that was +11. So
that's landslide territory. I mean, 340 electoral college votes. Does that mean that Texas goes Democratic?
Well, Texas and Georgia are competitive states, and if Texas and Georgia went Democratic, it would be an electoral college landslide. I don't think in the end that will happen. The tendency is for states to revert to where they've been in the past as you get closer to the election. But that's the upside for Democrats, which means that a bunch of Republican senators who are considered relatively safe at the moment could lose. Again, I don't think that's going to happen. I'm not predicting it, but we never had Hillary Clinton leading by more than 6 points in 2016. And we've had Biden, our high water mark has been +11.
And we spoke to Doug Rivers from YouGov. Now, they use a large online panel, so it's not a live calling method. And they have, I guess, the advantage also that they can recontact people from their panel who they spoke to 4 years ago and 2 years ago. So his view was that 7% of those Trump voters in 2016 will switch to Biden, and only 1% will switch in the other way. So that's why he's pretty confident at a strong Biden advantage. What do you say to that?
Well, I say I can't debate those numbers. We certainly don't recall people. We believe in truly anonymous and truly random stratified polling, so we don't do that. I can say this. I think with the number of people who are going to the other direction, certainly there are Trump voters who are not voting for him this time. There are voters who voted for someone else last time who are now considering Trump. The other thing is the number of people who didn't vote for either person that are coming out. We see it. There's a lot of new voter registration, but more over the support that Trump has are people who are actually going to participate who didn't participate last time, who have been registered voters, and for whatever reason, we call them lapsed voters. They haven't participated in the process for quite some time. What we do see, though, is, one of the things I say all the time is, this is not a persuasion election. It is a motivation election. Both sides have enough voters to win the election. This is going to come down to who turns their voters out. There's no question in my mind about this. This will be a very large turnout election, and the team that does the best job at getting their people to vote is going to be the one that wins. There's not a set number of people that are going to vote, and it's just a matter of fighting for some undecideds.
We do not have Trump up in a single battleground state. Even the wider set, which includes states like Iowa and Ohio, which are must-wins for Republicans, which had not been thought to be competitive before this year. And we're showing both Ohio and Iowa as even, and fairly substantial Biden leads. I think 6 points in Pennsylvania, 10 points in Michigan. As I just said, 8 points in Wisconsin. So either we're badly off or this is not going to be close.
I mean, if that all comes true and doesn't narrow dramatically between now and November, we could be looking at a even larger electoral college victory than 340. I mean, is it 400 plus?
Well, to get to 400, you got to pick up states like Texas and Georgia.
Which you don't think is going to happen?
I don't think that's likely.
When we spoke to Nate, he's got his model, which is lots of polls feeding into a, model of some kind that his team are doing. And I said, well, how do you know that your model isn't biased, or you haven't, included your own presumptions in the architecture of the model? Is it your view, just theoretically, that any model is potentially susceptible to biases, preconceptions?
Oh, certainly. Modeling is difficult, and if it were perfect, we'd all retire and after having beaten the stock market.
But in other words, just because they're complicated and they produce lots of more charts and lots of probabilistic outcomes, it doesn't actually mean that they're any more quote unquote reliable.
Yeah, I mean, each approach has its problems. So what 538 does is they take all the polls that are out there. They try to adjust the polls for what their accuracy and biases have been in the past. They have a so-called fundamentals model that's based on largely the state of the economy. And they put all those together, and they come up with a prediction for each state and a prediction for the Electoral College. The good thing about that approach is that you're averaging across many polls, whereas in the past, people looked at a single poll and that was noisy and they would overreact to that. That's the strength. The bad news is anything that moves all the polls in one direction incorrectly moves their forecast in the incorrect direction. We use a different approach called Mr. P, multi-level regression and post-stratification, that takes just our own data, no other pollster data, and adjusts that based on the past vote of these people, their demographics. And so it gets around the biases that you have in a single poll sample. But it's less data than a poll aggregator like 538 uses. So each has its benefits and its limitations.
So, and how about your own presumptions in that? I mean, I'm not saying,
I believe the numbers I'm producing. We've been doing this for a while. It's very mechanical at this point. That is, there's not a lot of judgment going into it. We back test whenever we consider a change. We see how it would have affected us in 2012 or 2016. But it is, fundamentally a machine that produces numbers, and we've used it in hundreds of elections at this point, and so we have a pretty good idea of how accurate it is.
So let's consider the what you would call minority chance scenario that Trump is victorious. Do you put a percentage likelihood on that in the?
We're working on that.
Nate talks about a 30% chance.
Yeah. We've tried to resist putting probabilities on because they're very hard to get right. We make lots of vote predictions, and it's easy for us to see over hundreds of elections, how far off our vote predictions were. But if you get to like a probability of winning the Electoral College, I've been doing this since, 2008. There are not a lot of cases. And you ask yourself, events that occur 10% of the time, how likely are you to see those? Well, it turns out you're fairly likely to see those on and off. And it's hard to tell whether those are happening 10% of the time or 30% of the time or 1% of the time.
So actually, there's almost a sense in which this whole kind of move to probability and percentage likelihoods is a bit of a cop-out, because what it says is, okay, it's 30% of the time. If it goes the Trump direction, he says, well, I told you it was 30% of the time. It wasn't a non-insignificant chance. In fact, the olden days where people, put their balls on the line and said, this is what I think is going to happen, in some ways were preferable.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. If you make the wrong prediction, but I only said it was going to happen with 70% probability, and someone else said it was going to happen with 90%, or a bunch of people said 99%. Basically, they're all wrong, and you're winning the consolation prize by saying I attach the lowest probability to it.
So would it be fair to say that you predict Donald Trump will lose the election?
Absolutely.
With a high degree of confidence?
What I would describe as a moderately high degree of confidence at this stage.
Okay, so what would have to happen?
I think the betting markets, which are showing this about 50-50, I think are underestimating the chances of a Biden win.
So whichever way the betting pundits go, most people seem to think it's a minority chance, whether you call it 10% or 20% or 35%, of a Donald Trump re-election, and more likely that Joe Biden wins. So let's zoom in on that minority chance event. I asked each of our experts, what between now and then in the real world could make that minority event a reality?
There is a chance that conditions on the ground improve in the United States by November. The three big stories here are COVID, the economy, and the racial protests.
Right.
So each of those are interesting, right? On COVID, the U.S. has had a very big, I wouldn't call it a second wave. I'm technical about those semantics, right? But like, we certainly had a big peak of cases in a good half of the country or more in the summer. Those cases are now coming down. Will they continue to come down? That's something you can debate, right? But you can imagine that they would. Or you can imagine they wouldn't, but it's an upside scenario for Trump.
Let me pause you on that one, because it's definitely of interest. You've actually figured the COVID-19 stats in your model, in the 538 model. That's right?
We have in a sort of indirect way. But we account for, one thing you're trying to do when you're building a model is accounting for how states might be correlated with one another. So for example, it was very important in 2016 that Michigan and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and Ohio, all these states that are similar demographically, are located next to one another. It was not a coincidence that all those states moved toward Trump, right? So we're looking for different sources in our model of correlation. And this year we account for the fact that, okay, maybe COVID could be a source of correlation. What if Trump does worse in states that have a higher COVID outbreak? So we technically are using COVID data. We don't make as many assumptions about like what trajectory that will take.
Okay, so you may not incorporate the data into the model, but do you have a personal view as to scenarios where COVID could be important in the election? In
the US, interestingly, some of the places that have not been hit in kind of either the spring wave or the summer wave were kind of the upper Midwest, right? Like states like Wisconsin, Minnesota, Ohio. Michigan got hit pretty hard in March and April, but enough states have caught up with it now, where it's, I think, actually like a little bit below the median, right? So if I had to pinpoint a set of states where I was most worried about a COVID outbreak in the fall, it might be the Midwest, because they weren't hit very hard before. I don't think people are, depending on how much seroprevalence matters, we can debate that, but like also think that people are probably being less careful than they were. They haven't been taught kind of the lesson the hard way, right? And it gets cold up there, and if people are going back indoors, right? So, I would be worried about like, what if there's a big outbreak in Wisconsin, for example, which hasn't been hit very hard in November, for instance.
Right.
We don't know, right?
Which brings us back to politics, because clearly the one place the president doesn't want there to be a big or full outbreak is Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. Yeah.
Kind of the states that had been relatively, everyone in the U.S. has been hit pretty bad, right? But, the states that have been relatively spared so far are actually some of the states where the election could be decided potentially.
And how about economic data?
We look at economic data, including economic forecasts and the stock market, and that data tends to point toward a fairly steep, in some ways, recovery in the United States. So in theory, Trump could be telling a story where, hey, look, all these jobs are coming back, COVID is going back down, and it was tough, but we've turned the corner.
As the concern and the attitude about the virus changes, and we are seeing a significant change there, we have this question about how you are relating to the virus, how you're dealing with it. And the answer we used to see the most of was people who were extremely cautious and extremely worried. And now our answer of they're not worried at all about it. And the more common answer has become the one that is, I'm going to do what I can to keep my family safe, but I'm not going to live in fear, and I'm going to go about living my life. That plus I'm not worried about it at all well over 50% now, and it's moving. And it's why people get frustrated about any talk of more lockdowns. It's just the idea of they're ready to get back to it. They're ready to wear their mask, wash their hands, keep their distance, but they're not going to just hide around, they're not hiding in their houses anymore. They're done with all that.
So you actually think that COVID-19 could become an electoral plus for Donald Trump over time?
I think it more depends on how Biden talks about it. Shortly after his convention, he talked about there might, if there was a need for another lockdown, he would do it. I think if you would ask, just from what I've seen, if you would ask the question, is there any scenario where there should be another lockdown? I think if the question was about this particular virus, people would say that there's nothing worth that. That they really feel like everybody knows how to be safe now. They knows how to minimize the risk, and they don't want to see the economy wrecked and their lives wrecked when they think they can handle the risk to a reasonable level, doing the precautions that we all agree are the right ones.
We've gone into two of those kind of factors, COVID and the economy. The third one you mentioned is the riots. On your model, you show which state is the one that tilts over the Electoral College votes, and that is Wisconsin more commonly than other states in your model. So obviously we've had riots in Wisconsin. The New York Times ran a piece about Kenosha County and how residents there, some of them were saying that they kind of are pleased that they voted for Trump. Those ones felt reinforced in that decision by the violence. Do you think, obviously we would not want that, there to be violence and there to be more riots, but do you think the Trump side would benefit from violence getting worse, put bluntly?
First of all, we have this funny question about how we're addressing situations like Kenosha. Because you have protests, you have some violent activity around those protests. It's not always clear that the people who are engaged in the protests are the people who are engaging in violent activity or not. And that framing is important. There's academic research showing that, when you have peaceful protests, these protests are pretty popular in the United States, that tends to help liberals and democratic causes, right? When it becomes violent, then it might not be so helpful. The problem for Trump is that a lot of Americans think that Trump is racist, including people who vote for him. And when Trump tries to intervene, so when Trump went out to Lafayette Square in Washington and did the Bible thing, right? Yeah. That moment saw one of the biggest shifts in the polls against him. So if there were sporadic kind of inchoate things going on in the background, there's violence in some number of American cities, it's ambiguous what it is it a protest or is it looting or whatever else, right? And it's kind of looking in the background, and it gets framed in the press as being mostly these kind of violent outbreaks. Maybe that could help Trump, but the more of a big deal he tries to make it to be, then people will come out and a lot of peaceful protesting will occur, maybe along with other stuff, but by and large, the protests in the U.S. in June and so forth were fairly peaceful after some initial violence in some cities. And that might not help Trump, especially because he's also the incumbent. Usually if you are saying, I will restore law and order, that's because the guy in charge right now has not brought about law and order. And he can say, okay, well, it's Democrat-run cities and states where this is mostly occurring. Right. But still, it's a much trickier argument to make if you're an incumbent.
I will tell you something I was told a long time ago when I first started being involved in politics. People vote against things, not for things. Until about 6 months ago, there were a lot of people motivated to vote against Donald Trump. But then in the wake of the tragedy of Mr. Floyd being murdered, there were protests. And some of those protests turned into violence. And that violence turned into a defund the police movement, a Black Lives Matter movement that went beyond simply protecting Black lives, a call for statues to be torn down. We got to the point a week before July 4th where people were suggesting Mount Rushmore was offensive. And all of a sudden, Americans who weren't even necessarily big fans of Donald Trump said, what is happening in my country? There became a genuine debate as to whether America's foundation, its principles, its purpose was good or bad. And people still believe in America. And if you make that choice, one side thinks that America has a history to apologize for and isn't a good force in the world, and the other side feels like America is a good force in the world and has a history to learn from, but certainly a history that is also very positive in many ways. That's not a good scenario for an American to get elected president. I think Joe Biden's on the wrong side of that.
So if that's right, I mean, Nate Silver was saying that the moment he saw the biggest slump in support for Trump was during that moment when he cleared the streets and he stood outside of the chapel and held the Bible. Apparently that actually was a negative moment for him and he lost support.
I'm not talking about that moment. Again, that's not the moment to vote against. I can see how that moment could do it. But the slump I'm talking about is the slump that starts every time somebody shared a video of somebody else throwing a Molotov cocktail in the street of a town. Every time somebody is on, people see messages about defunding police and people rallying and talking about killing policemen and how that would be fair. That's the stuff that also motivates people to vote against. And that stuff is not happening in a vacuum. It took Biden's campaign and a month to actually admit they were against the violence. That they saw. Here's the thing: what politicians say means very little to me. What politicians do means everything. And the fact that Biden kind of reversed course and started criticizing the violence after months of embracing it or suggesting it doesn't exist tells me he knows it's real.
So what would have to happen for that Trump victory to surprise everybody and take place in your view? Do you think you would need a big event to kind of change the terms, or do you think it would be enough for, the economy to go well, COVID to go well, maybe there to be some disquieting riots around the place that upset people? Do you think it could happen organically, or do you think there would need to be a big event to change the shape of the race?
If we are right that this is, an 8, 9, even 10-point race at the moment, it would take an event. And we've been waiting since the middle of 2015 for an event that would significantly impact Trump's popularity one way or the other, and we haven't seen it.
A military campaign, for example? I mean, that's what people speculate. Suddenly we're going to see, troop movements in the South China Sea or something. So
I'll play pundit at this point. Most of these things are not working well for Trump, that he doesn't have high credibility on it. You'd normally think a president, if he said something was a national emergency, foreign policy event, a pandemic, and so forth, the country would rally behind him. And you even saw a little of that at the end of March when he started taking the pandemic seriously. But the lack of discipline and the constantly changing message and the inability to reach across the ideological divide, to be bipartisan, that's just not in his DNA. And so I think if he took some military action in the next month, most people would dismiss it as wag the dog.
We've considered one kind of bias, which is that the consensus view showing a healthy advantage for Joe Biden is actually biased against Donald Trump, because rather like 2016, there's some kind of effect that suppresses Trump support in the polls. But what if the opposite is true? It feels to me, at least, watching from afar, that there is this kind of big shadow cast by the last election result. And that within the kind of media elites, but also within pollster world, there's a kind of fear in the bones, or a sort of almost like a superstition, that somehow it's bound to be a Trump victory in some kind of illogical way. Do you notice that? Do you sense that when you're with people you're working with? Does that kind of superstition exist?
Oh, for sure. If you divorce yourself from anything else, right, and say there was a recent outcome that a lot of people found traumatizing for various reasons, and you combine that with the fact that people tend to overweight, there's recency bias and salience bias, right? So people tend to overweight recent outcomes and more salient outcomes. So just from first principles, you would think that people might overrate the chance of Trump winning just based on their kind of emotional reaction, and that a lot of what they're doing is kind of emotionally hedging, right? Yeah. Where they're saying, okay, well, sure, Biden is up in the polls, but like, it's going to be so terrible if Trump wins that I'm just going to tell myself that that's 50-50 that Trump is a favorite. Yeah. I think there's a lot of that going on.
As you know, I was involved in a polling company for a long time, and the kind of trauma of elections you get wrong sits around with you. And normally, I feel like a kind of reasonable heuristic is to expect that people will overcorrect for the previous era. So maybe we're sitting here and everyone's kind of getting spooked about this minority Trump chance, but maybe Biden is way, way further ahead even than the polls are showing.
It's possible. I mean, you've had stuff like that happen in the UK before, where there were a number of elections in a row where the Tories were underrated, and then I forget, it was last time, right, or 2 elections ago now, right, where Labour was significantly underrated. So, and that it involved also some pollsters, I think, putting kind of a thumb on the scale and saying, okay, well, look, we know we're always biased against Tories, so let's kind of make all these kind of not so solid adjustments, right? And you wind up overcompensating.
It's not even putting a thumb on the scales, you know. If, for example, like one of the main errors they made in 2016 was that they underestimated turnout among Trump voters, basically, because they came from demographics that didn't normally vote in those numbers. And maybe now they're presuming, they've sort of corrected for that error, and they presume that similar levels will happen this time, and they won't. It's back to a more normal election. So that's the kind of way that pollsters will get it wrong.
So maybe they don't turn out, but there's also kind of more subtle form of, I don't know if you want to call it overcorrecting, right? But what it could be is that you take every step to ensure, maybe correctly, that you're counting all the white working class non-college Trump voters, but you don't take any step to ensure, as many steps to ensure you're counting enough Hispanic and Black voters. Because there were some states like California and Arizona and Texas where Clinton beat her polls in 2016. Nobody cared because she lost the key states, right? But there were groups among which Clinton overperformed. And if you were to ignore those, it's like the Hispanic population grows in the US, Asian American population grows, right? Like if your poll is only conducted in English, for example, then that might have certain problems, missing primarily Spanish-speaking Latinos and Latinas in America. If you're doing a poll by traditional telephone, although almost all pollsters call cell phones now, right? You might miss younger voters who don't have landlines in their homes. Again, that's pretty rare now, but there are a handful of polls that are doing robo-polls that miss cell phones. And so, we could wake up and say, oh, actually, turnout among Blacks and Latinos was really high. When pollsters thought it would be kind of mediocre, and so Biden won by 11 points instead of 8 or whatever. I mean, that's very possible.
If you were betting money right now, you think the bargain is not in the direction of a Trump victory, but actually in the other direction. In other words, even though it's a majority, they've underpriced the likelihood of a Biden victory.
So first of all, ethically and under contract with my employer, right?
Understood.
I cannot bet on prediction markets. But if I were purely looking to play the markets and I didn't have an ethical problem with doing it, right, then I would think that the price on Biden is very favorable. But it doesn't mean I would actually bet on it for all the reasons I described. But
so when you look back at 2016, both YouGov but also other pollsters that were more out, what do you think of as the kind of the thing that they did get wrong? Was it a question of underestimating the enthusiasm of Trump supporters so that demographics that don't normally turned out more than expected? Is that a fair conclusion?
So the rural white vote for Trump turned out at a higher rate than we expected. And the urban, mostly minority vote, which is a big deal in the Midwest, turned out at lower rates.
So for polls this time round, do you expect 2016 levels of turnout in those two groups, or do you expect the conventional levels of turnout from previous races?
We expect very high turnout based on what happened in 2018. The support for Trump is very enthusiastic, and And based on what people are telling us in their polls, the ones that voted for Trump are going to come out and vote for him again. But we expect what happened in 2018 to reoccur, which is Democrats really hate Trump, and they're more enthusiastic about Joe Biden than Hillary Clinton.
So when you think about this race and the data you've got, do you think it's more likely that you're underplaying the Biden advantage because of this concept of fighting the last war or correcting for the last problem?
I don't know. I mean, everyone talks solely in terms of tightening, and I do think the race has tightened slightly in the last few weeks, but it can go both directions. The tendency is for incumbents to lose vote at the end of a campaign, not to gain votes. And there certainly is plenty of room for Trump to lose votes. But I think Democrats are very worried about a repeat of 2016 and are laser focused on avoiding that.
So it sounds like the Doug Rivers view could be summed up as he's toast.
Not quite, but close. He's browning rapidly.
That was Doug Rivers from YouGov. Our thanks to him for his time. Also thanks to Nate Silver from 538 and Robert Cahaly from Trafalgar. Three very different but very interesting views on what is going to happen on November the 3rd. Having worked at a polling company, I can tell you it is a nervous experience. There will be some anxious, furrowed brows in those three offices in the days coming up to and after November 3rd. So we'll be thinking of them. We'll definitely be doing some other interesting and hopefully insightful interviews before then and keeping a close eye on what's happening. This was Lockdown TV. Thanks for joining.